Morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a lovely Halloween last night and didn't stay up too late eating all your bounty that was left over from your door knockers. Welcome to the Curriculum Committee of the Board. We're going to get started. We've got a big presentation on testing data today. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. So our curriculum team is sitting in front of you. We will have each of them participate in the presentation. I'm going to sit back and let them do that. But I think we've done a really nice job, hopefully both showing you our overall data and then disaggregated for our state level data. So you'll see PSA today and our Keystone exam data today. We'll talk about strengths and we'll talk about areas of growth as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jason Lilly, who just got his doctorate. So that's a big congratulations to start the presentation.
Thank you, everybody.
Jump back in there.
Yeah. So good morning. We have the opportunity today to share our results from our state assessment data. You see the curriculum team in front of you here today. Each of us will take the opportunity to speak to the areas we directly oversee across the district. So some of us, as you can see, the breakdown is K through 6 and then 7 through 12. So our elementary supervisors will talk about the elementary up through 6th grade, and then our secondary supervisors, myself included, will talk through what you see at the 7 through 12 range of our state assessment data. Next slide, please. Before we jump into the data, just bringing this back to the forefront, this visual is a representation of how our district kind of digs into data. MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, is something that we have brought to the district over the past couple of years. It is the focus of what we do and how we enter into these things. Data is at the forefront of MTSS, really understanding what kids know and are able to do and where their struggles may continue to be and what we do about those different things. Today, you will see really the top 2 levels of this chart, of this visual. From a district perspective, we'll share grade level and Keystone level information with you today, and we'll also share out subgroup information across the district from a district lens. Just so you are aware, as soon as district data becomes available to us, our team digs in and then we share that data with our principals and our buildings, and they then continue down this data funnel, really digging into what's happening specifically to their building and within their building, their teachers, their staff, and their students in order to, in the end, really provide those specific supports that kids need to continue to grow and be successful. Next. We always start these presentations by sharing our participation rate, and this year, you notice it's there, it's bold, it's in red. This is the first year that we have ever exceeded the 95% threshold for participation rate. This is an area that the state does require, and any time a district does not reach that 95% threshold, the state assesses additional penalties on the district for performance. Anytime you're beyond or below that 95% threshold, any percentage below that is automatically deemed as being unsuccessful and counts against you from the district. So for this year, for the first time, we will not have any district penalties assessed to us. So the information you see today will be information from the students who actually participated in these assessments, and those would be the same scores the state would give us and would become public without additional penalty for the first time here at Lower Merion. Next slide. This slide is not our data. This is the data from across the entire state. This is representative of about 170,000 students across the state. And so this is shared with everyone today because the trends that you see across the state are sometimes reflected in our own data, and at other times we see information on our scores that are the exact opposite of what you see across the state trends. And usually that's in a positive way. So you'll see both today. But what I'll highlight here briefly with the state information is that across the English language arts scores, you'll see that they are largely consistent from grade 3 through grade 8, and then again on the Keystone exam. In math, totally different trend. In math, 3rd grade, only 52% of the students across the state are able to successfully complete and successfully pass that PSSA exam at a proficient or advanced level. And by 8th grade, that number is cut in half. So by 8th grade, between 3rd and 8th grade, even though only a little more than half of the students are able to successfully complete that exam, in that process, the state as a whole loses half of those kids, and that half of those kids are not able to be successful by the 8th grade. On the Algebra Keystone exam, the scores bump up a little bit across the state. You will see some of those trends in our data, but what I will highlight, and I'll come back to later in the presentation, is that in 8th grade, the state is at a 26% pass rate. It is extremely low. It is the lowest of all the scores across this chart, across the state. 8th grade math has been a focus point for us here in the last several years because it was historically one of our lowest scores as well. You'll see some of the changes in our results this year from those concerted efforts, and it's something I'm excited to share. In science across the state, you see a trend similar to math. Every time there is an assessment given in science, the scores drop year over year. Science also remains the only state assessment that is a cumulative assessment, so that 4th grade exam is science up through 4th grade. The 8th grade exam is science from 5th through 8th grade. And then the Bio Keystone is a biology exam, end of course exam. But it is the only remaining cumulative assessment, and some of what you'll see in our data today is reflective of some of that information happening over a 4-year period of time. So retention sometimes is a challenge. Next slide. So we're going to transition into our math scores. The presentation today will be broken out by content area. So we're going to start with our math scores. These are our district math scores over the last 3 years. Just to highlight as a reminder, this is the first year we have data from our new model, which is our K-4 elementary, 5-8 middle school model. So this is the first year we have data that is reflective of those changes. So 5th graders now being at our middle school. So for comparative purposes, again, today you're going to see district level data. Just remember, it's challenging when we try to compare year over year to buildings because our model is different this year. This past year, it changed. Looking at our math data, there are increases at all levels. Many of these scores, and you'll see that later in the presentation, are the highest scores we have ever attained in this district. Even though it is yet unofficial, we are very confident that this year we will be the #1 highest achieving district in the state of Pennsylvania. We were #2 last year. With the increases we see across all these grade levels, we are very confident that this year will be the year we will be #1 in the state of Pennsylvania for math. And if we knew that, I would have worn a shirt that said #1. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Aconchi-Mesa for the elementary math scores.
I got to have it down by after 15 years. That was wonderful for us. Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. The next set of slides will focus on PSSA proficiency levels in math in grades 3 to 6, and Jason just shared the district data with you. You will see that the PSSA achievement data is disaggregated by student group, including major racial and ethnic groups and economically disadvantaged students. This is to ensure maximum transparency around student group performance. These groups are referred to as subgroups during the presentation. So grade 3, looking at grade 3 overall scores, they have increased since 2021. This year is the highest score for grade 3. Jason had mentioned there were several grade levels who have achieved the highest score in the district. So grade 3 is one of them. Subgroup scores have also shown improvement since 2021, with our Hispanic and economically disadvantaged group showing significant growth. Subgroup scores remain consistent or showed significant growth from last year to this year. Okay, next slide. Grade 4 overall scores, including those of our subgroups, increased significantly from 2021 and remain consistent from last year to this year, except for our African American subgroup, which showed a decrease from 63% to 56%. Okay, next slide. Grade 5 overall scores, including those of our subgroups, have continued to increase except for our Hispanic student group, which showed a decline from 75% to 69% from last year to this year. As with grade 3, this is the highest score for this grade level. Our grade 6 scores grew significantly from 2022 to 2023. Our subgroup scores have also shown improvement from 2021 and remained consistent or showed significant growth from last year to this year. Okay. So overall, our math scores in grades 3 to 6 are showing great gains, significant gains for grades 5 and 6 from last year to this year. This year, the number of students who scored in the basic and below basic categories in grades 3, 5, and 6 decreased, with a higher number of students scoring in the advanced category. Next slide. Areas of strength and growth have been identified at each grade level. In grade 3, strength was identified as operations in algebraic thinking, in particular multiplication and division. An area for growth for grade 3 that has been identified is geometry. Grade 4, strength, base 10, whole number, place value, and whole number operations, and geometry for the properties of two-dimensional figures. And an area of growth that has been identified for grade 4 is measurement, in particular, based on our district data. It was looked at as conversions as being an area we need to focus on in grade 4. Grade 5 is strength, once again, whole number operations, as well as decimal place value and whole number operations. And area for growth is computation of fractions, in particular addition and subtraction, as well as numerical expressions and evaluating expressions. So those are the areas we're going to need to focus more on this year in our spiral reviews, as well as in our curriculum units pertaining to those concepts. Grade 6, area of strength is geometry, which includes area, surface area, and volume. And an area for growth that we identified for grade 6 is ratio concepts. So regarding Tier 1 instruction, the continued use of our formative and summative data is used to form flexible guided math groups that provides opportunities for teachers to meet small groups of students with push and support from the math specialists when possible. Our resources for intervention and enrichment are included in all of the K-5 curriculum math unit documents. Additional adaptive online resources such as Dreambox in K-4, IXL in grades 5 and 6 are used to personalize learning, meet students' needs where they are, and monitor growth. And we also have spiral reviews that are implemented daily in grades 3 to 6. Regarding Tier 2 instruction, data is carefully analyzed and reviewed to identify students who need or continue to need support by the math specialist in addition to the Tier 1 math instruction, where the math specialist can also push into support where possible. Our targeted analysis and use of data is also a focus in the PLC grade level meeting discussions that is led by either the 5-6 math content lead or the math specialist using the 4 PLC critical questions. So we had this year an addition of a 5-6 content lead, which has really helped immensely with those discussions in the PLCs. Last year we had 1 content lead. Win time at the elementary level and I&E at the middle level also provide opportunities for students to get additional support, practice, or enrichment. And we also have, starting soon, our after-school math program in grades 2 and or 3. And I'm not sure if this is the time, but we're also reviewing math resources, new math resources for grades 6, 7, and 8, and possibly grade 5. So we're in the process of that review now as well. Okay, next slide. Okay.
All right, I'm going to jump back in with our 7 through 12 math scores. Starting with grade 7, in general, you'll see year over year our scores have increased and they have returned to our pre-pandemic levels. The exception for this past year's assessment was our African American subgroup, which did dip slightly. But to put that in perspective, when that same cohort of students was assessed in 6th grade math, they were at the 26th percentile. So again, thinking about the state trend in math, there are slight decreases year over year, even for our data, and that group did have a slight dip from their prior year. You don't see cohort data in our charts, but that is something that we do look at also. So that particular group was at 26% in 6th grade. One of the things that I'm going to, hold on, sorry. Next slide, please. In the 8th grade achievement data, all the groups are scoring higher than the previous year, and as you see, again, bolded in red, this was our highest 8th grade achievement score ever. Our African achievement in this particular group has gone up significantly over the past 2 years. If you notice, and I'm going to draw attention to it here, as we did in 2021, that group was achieving at 5%. Now, again, this is not cohort data. This is different groups of students year over year. But we know both nationally and across the state that through the pandemic, there were specific subgroups that were affected more during COVID from a learning perspective, and African American and economically disadvantaged were two of the groups that struggled the most with math coming out of the pandemic. We saw that in our results, but it's really enlightening to see the change that we've seen over the past 2 years, going from 5% up to 40%. And I'm also going to share and remind people that this 8th grade was the year the state success rate is 26% across the state for all kids. We are at almost 70% success rate. To put some of the subgroups in perspective, the state success rate for African American in 8th grade is 8%. And what might surprise some people here or in our district is that the success rate for white students across the state on the 8th grade math PSSA is 32%. So our African American subgroups achieving at the 40th percentile right now puts them ahead of the state average and also ahead of subgroups like the white subgroup across the state. So it's a significant increase for us. It's something we know we can still do significantly better with, and we will continue to do so, but it was worth highlighting today in comparison to both our growth over time and to the rest of the state. Next slide, please. So in 8th grade, what are some of the things we've done? We increased the rigor of our local assessments and our spiral reviews. These are things we use year over year, and we make adjustments accordingly based on what we see in our data and how our students are performing. So we increased the rigor and expectation on our own local assessments and our reviews that we use to prepare kids to retain some of the information over time. Our math specialists, and Nancy alluded to this, we've added some additional content leaders that has allowed us to have more people with hands on the data. And so we had our math specialists more involved with analyzing that data, sharing the results with teachers and staff, and then working with our kids. We've had, because of the middle school schedule, I said this is our first year of data under the new alignment of our district with our grade levels, but also our new middle school schedule. We have an intervention and enrichment period. And so we've been able to use that time to really hone in on some of the needs of our students and provide additional supports that maybe were more challenging to provide in the past just because of the time that we now have in our schedule. So that was there as well. Digging into where did we score highly, solving real world problems and modeling with functions were identified as areas of strength, and places to grow and continue to grow were operations with rational numbers, which is fractions really at the secondary level. So what happens as we progress up through fractions? So we see, that sort of continuing up through the vertical piece, and our geometric transformations as another area of growth. So what we do is, again, when we see those things jump out, even though this was our highest achievement score ever in this grade level, we will now hone in on these things, and we make sure that we're incorporating them even more into our common assessments used across the 3 middle schools now, and providing additional targeted support and intervention based on what we see through those assessments and spiral reviews. Next slide. Shifting into Keystone results. So this is the Algebra 1 Keystone results over the past 3 years. This is an assessment that is taken at all 5 of our secondary schools. All 3 middle schools and both high schools have this assessment being offered and given in their schools. This score of 77% achievement is our highest achievement score, even though it's not highlighted in red. It's our highest achievement score since we started testing our students upon completing the Algebra 1 content. There was a time in our school's history where we were assessing our students after Algebra 2, which skews our results a little bit as we go back in time. The state asked us to correct that, and we did. So this is actually the highest score we've had since shifting to assessing our students after Algebra 1. Next slide. We do break this data out into middle school and high school because it's assessed at all 5 buildings. We have shown increases district-wide over time, but we also made some transitions. So there are a couple things in play here that I'm going to highlight. In 2019, those numbers aren't up there just because it's pre-pandemic. They're up there because that was when we used to teach Algebra 1 geometry and Algebra 2. That is the last year that we offered our old sequence of math courses. Starting in 2021, we had integrated math in place, and we also shifted our schedule. The end numbers you see up there are reflective of that shift because when we shifted to integrated math, students took the algebra keystone at the end of integrated math 2. It shifted more students to take that exam in the high school than in the middle school. It eliminated much of the double testing that we had between our 7th and 8th grade students having to take a PSSA and a keystone at the same time. So you see the end numbers decrease over time. That's because of the shift in both our sequencing and how we deliver the Algebra 1 content, which happens over 2 years of time now. What you'll see here is we are at 100% success rate. These are our most accelerated students in the district. We would expect them to score very highly, and they do. You will see, though, the shift in our sequencing has changed the results so that we have a significantly higher number of students scoring advanced and 100% of our students meeting with success. Last year, the exception was 1 student across the district did not achieve proficient or advanced, but otherwise over the last 3 years, 100% of our students have been successful at the middle level after this change. Next slide. At the high school level, again, you see the shift at the top with the number of students participating in the exam. Again, that's a result of shifting both content and our sequencing. At the high school, this is our highest percent of proficient and advanced ever. It is also our highest percentage of students scoring advanced ever at the high school level. You can see those trends by following the arrows from our pre-pandemic Algebra 1 delivery into our 3 years now of integrated math at the high school level. Again, both things in play, shifting both when students take the exam and also how that content is delivered. But we continue to see increases year over year, even since the implementation of integrated math. Next slide. So looking at Algebra 1 overall, across the district, we have more students scoring advanced than before the pandemic. That's important to note. That 54% number of students scoring advanced is higher than the state achievement if you were to add the state success rate for advanced and proficient together. Advanced and proficient combined for the state only totals 37% of the students across the state. So we have a larger percentage of kids scoring advanced than the state has who are even able to be successful on this exam. So we really have done well on the algebra keystone. Digging a little deeper, linear equations and slope and rate of change are identified as areas of strengths for us. That is something that feels good to me because slope and rate of change was identified a couple years ago as an area of growth, and now it's an area of strength. So that means what we did and what we dug into has worked, and that's what you like to see. Inequalities and systems of inequalities are identified as areas of continued growth for us, especially at the high school level. Again, differences between the middle school scores and the high school scores. Those middle school students taking that assessment are our most accelerated students and are for the most part double accelerated in mathematics. So at the high school, these are areas of focus. Again, similar to what happens at the middle level, we're gonna make sure that we include these and create some more common assessments around these, both formative and summative, and then providing additional targeted intervention and supports at the high school level based on the data. One thing that I'll highlight here, which was just interesting in seeing connections to some of the things we do across the district back to the data, is when we hire anyone to teach in our math department at the secondary level, we have a performance task that they must complete as part of that process. The performance task includes systems of equations and inequalities. It asks them things like, demonstrate 3 ways that you would be able to teach students how to do those kind of problems. It also has error analysis. It asks questions like, what are the common mistakes students make when they're graphing a system of inequalities? So seeing that that is something that's a continued area of focus for us for growth, it's more important than ever that we're hiring staff that are able to deliver that in ways that make sense for kids. So that was just a nice connection to see through the data back to some of our processes in-house. Next slide. So those are our math results. We're going to transition to science. What you see here are 4th grade and 8th grade science assessment data. Remember, these are the last remaining cumulative assessments that the state has. This was, again, where the trend across the state was year over year, the scores dropped significantly, including on the bio keystone. So what you'll see here is our 4th grade assessment is close to 100%. It has been and continues to be one of the highest in the state. But we are close to 100% success rate on 4th grade. In 8th grade, we do have the decline similar to the state, but ours is nowhere near the dip that you see going from 4th grade to 8th grade across the state. Our 8th grade scores are now close to 90%. That 89, which you will see again in a different slide, is our highest achievement rate on science in the 8th grade exam ever in the history of the district as well. So we're performing very highly in multiple areas across the district. We'll talk a little bit more into that now. Next slide.
Okay, as Jason said, the overall scores for 4th grade remain high and consistent from 2021 to 2023. Our subgroup scores have also been consistent or showed significant growth from 2021 to 2023. Our African American student group had a 5% decline, however, from last year to this year. And since this is the first time students take the test, we are unable to do a cohort comparison. So these are 2 different cohorts of students. But because it's the first time they take the test, we're unable to do that cohort comparison. So the number of students who score in the basic and below basic category remain very low, with only 1 student scoring in the basic category, which is phenomenal. A large percentage of our students continue to score in the advanced category with 72%. That's 448 of our students score in the advanced category last year. Our areas of strength for the PSSA science is structure and function of organisms, which is our ecosystems, which coincidentally was the PBL that was implemented in grade 4 last year. Areas for growth are weather and climate, as well as composition and structure of the universe. Weather, the last time what students see weather is in grade 2. And sun, moon, and planets is the last grade 4 science unit before PSSA. So next year, in conversation with Dory and collaboration with her, connections will be made to the social studies units where feasible, as well as ELA nonfiction texts and writing prompts. Alignment to the PA Steele standards will also begin to prepare for implementation of these standards in preparation for a new assessment in grade 5 in 2026.
Looking at 8th grade science, again, that 89% success rate is our highest we've had achievement-wise in the district. All subgroups experienced increases with significant growth since the pandemic for our our African American population and our Hispanic population. So significant increases there. Again, to just kind of put that in perspective across the state success rate on this assessment is 57%. Our subgroups, our African American and Hispanic subgroups, specifically the ones that I've drawn attention to here, are performing well above the state average at 74% and 83%. So we have seen tremendous growth over time, and we are outperforming the state across the board in all of our subgroups. In trying to dig into that a little bit, we've seen that systems, models, and patterns, along with conversion and transfer of energy, were areas of strength for us, just to kind of point out where those live a little bit in our curriculum. The first one is in our 7th grade curriculum, and the second one is in our 8th grade curriculum. Places where we have some challenge are composition and structure of the universe, which interestingly is the same thing you heard from 4th grade, is the solar system and the universe is something that is a challenge right now. So we see that continuing. So there's a vertical piece for us to take a hard look at. Just to highlight where that is in our curriculum, that's a 6th grade, mainly a 6th grade topic. And so again, these students are taking their assessment at the end of 8th grade, so they have 2.5 years of time between when they've seen this and when they're assessed on it. So that could be part of our challenge. So we know, and we've talked about this, but we're going to really zone in on it this year, is the idea of making sure that our cumulative assessments and our spiral reviews across our grade levels include those key points and topics that are important from different grade levels. And again, this is the one area, science, especially the 8th grade science, where over 4 years of secondary content, they're being assessed at the end of those 4 years. We know we have to spiral and review those things for retention purposes and to make sure students remember and know how to do some of those things. It gets challenging. We've also talked a little bit about shifting our curriculum to more of an integrated science approach right now. Our 6th grade is really earth and space, 7th grade is life science, and 8th grade is physical and chemical. Thinking about maybe blending those into more of an integrated approach so they see life science every year over the 3 or 4 years and physical science every year over 3 of the 4 years. Next generation science standards have a similar idea and approach. So those are some of the things we're considering as we shift our practice and to think about how can we make this experience even better for students. Again, this is our highest score ever, but we're always looking at places where we can do better and different, and so those are some of the things we're considering in the sciences at the secondary level. Next slide. For biology, our bio scores are historically some of the highest across the state. Even though we had a 2% dip this year, I'm confident that our scores will still be way up there across the state. Interestingly, the state had the exact same drop. So across the state, there was a 2% drop in overall achievement on the biology Keystone exam. We saw that exact same percentage, a 2% drop. We had a slight decrease. That slight decrease in this case can largely be attributed to our drop for our white students. Our white student performance dropped by 4% compared to the previous year, and that being our largest subgroup at 460 students, that impacts our overall score tremendously. The other subgroups, as you can see, remained largely consistent or showed increases. So in this particular case, the performance of our white students is actually what brought our overall scores down. So digging deeper, while I said we did have the same 2% drop as the state, unlike the state, our biology cohort actually increased year over year. When we look back at that cohort of students who had the 82% and that 2% drop, when we looked at their 8th grade PSSA scores, they were at 80%. So they actually showed a 2% increase. Remember, the state, every science exam that is given, the scores drop year over year, assessment over assessment. So we did not see a drop from the 8th grade performance to when those students took biology. We actually saw the scores go up, which is the complete opposite of the state trend. So while our scores are down a little bit, it's important that we do look at that cohort data to make sure what's happening with individual groups of students. And this particular group of students, I would not want to just say that they didn't do as well as they could have, because they actually did better than they did on the 8th grade assessment, and they are bucking the state trend and actually showing improvement rather than decline. So while it's not a success story, it is not a place where we want to highlight as a deficiency. Things we did strongly: transfer of energy within organisms and ecology, which has been an area of focus for us. Again, when you focus in on something, you want to see it become a strength, and ecology has certainly become that for us. Cell growth and genetic inheritance were areas of growth, and some of these things are those things that are hard to see and touch. Right? Genetic inheritance, traits being inherited year over year, those kind of things. It's something that's really hard to see. It's something that students in general struggle with in the sciences. So we're going to focus in on these topics. Again, biology, similar to what happens at the middle school, even though biology isn't a cumulative exam, we do cumulative reviews and spiraled reviews throughout our biology course. The language and the types of words that are in the biology course are very high level, and so we make sure that We're helping students understand that. One of the things that we've talked about doing for sure with these particular topics is finding ways to see this science come to life. You know, we talk about things like genetics and traits and what happens year over year and how things are passed along. If you can have visuals that represent what that looks like and why it happens, it helps kids make more sense of the science. So those are some things we're going to focus in on. And at this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Dory Martin-Patone, who's going to introduce our ELA scores.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Lilly. So you keep hearing this word consistent. The beauty and positivity in consistency is that it provides us a level of expectation, but it assists in our efforts to strive to do better. And we continuously, you have heard, look to say, how can we continue to grow and improve with these scores? So again, overall, we were consistent with shifts 6 through 8. You'll see a positive shift. And in 5th, from 2022 to 2023, the continued shift. In 3rd grade, also a slight increase. And in 4th, just we went up and then a slight decrease. You're going to continue to see these patterns as I go over the rest of the ELA data. As we go over the data, one thing we usually say in ELA and when we work with teachers and do some analysis is notice and note. So here are some things we noticed and what we made note of as continued to go through. Overall, in 3rd grade, we saw from 2022 to 2023 slight increases in the scores. Where there were slight dips previously, there now are slight increases to follow. The one area, the Hispanic subgroup, that is a subgroup that showed most growth previously, and we'll see it later on, but we did make note of the dip in their scores. In 4th grade, you will again see scores remained similar or had a slight increase or decrease. Just want to mention that in the multiracial group, as well as in the Asian group, just that high rate of consistency and also that increase from 22 to 23. We previously mentioned cohorts. We constantly notice and note and ask how are our cohorts achieving in our curriculum year to year. And that's where the work begins in determining the root causes of what we need to look at next. For grade 5, I think they did a phenomenal job in terms of a new middle school. We had to create a transformative curriculum. There were a lot of heavy lifts. That was a collective work, but I really want to give a shout out to the teachers and the leadership teams who were able to support that we could be consistent amidst all of those changes. So in this grade level, we remain the same. Multiracial, Asian, economically disadvantaged subgroups all increased. We had a decrease in, an increase in Asian and Hispanic subgroups that we wanted to make note from the year prior, specifically in the Hispanic subgroup. And then in grade 6, again, you'll see slight increases, slight decreases in a couple of the subgroups, overall consistent. Significant increases in multiracial and our Asian subgroups, while our economically disadvantaged subgroup and our white subgroup remain consistent in the higher percentages. As I mentioned previously, teachers are an integral part of this work, and their voices and their input and their perspective. We also utilize, you're seeing Digging Deeper. The state provides guidelines for Digging Deeper, which we refer to. It's reflective questions for analysis and root causes at the systems level. We ask ourselves, what can we do to assist in determining potential root causes that lead to action plans looking backward and forward? We also use these questions to generate thinking specific to analyzing data at system levels for both schools and our district. So I just want you to know that these are interconnected and it is a collaborative work. The analysis overall, we looked at our basic and below basic, and those percentages remain consistently low. So then when we look across our anchor areas, the standards. Key ideas and details, craft and structure for literature were our lowest percentages in grade 3. Our summer curriculum work this past year focused on alignment, K through 7, on literature, where the reading and the writing genres connected and aligned, and we began K through 7 with fiction. So I'll be curious, and it's wondering to see if that'll make an impact, considering grade 3 is our first year of the assessment and literature was our area of need. We also looked into grades 4 to 6 in text evidence, the text-dependent analysis portion of the assessment. We wanted to dig deeper and look at that continued movement across the achievement performance bands, which we did see. One of the things that stood out to us, what we noticed and noted, was that there was a higher number of students in grade 6 and below basic. So we really want to dig into who are these students, what are the things are we doing, what are we seeing, is there something that we missed in that alignment from 5th to 6th. Overall, we are doing many similar things with integrated learning. We use our PLCs for review of local data and monitoring progress, because you're going to hear assessments that are standards aligned as well as the assessment, grade level standards-based assessments. We also have guided reading levels, DIBELS data, benchmarks, and a multitude of formative assessments in our curriculum that are aligned. So the idea is we should see this along the way. This year, we introduced a standards-based benchmark for grades 3 through 6. We're utilizing Study Island. It has a baseline true benchmark to say, here's the end of the year standards in the beginning of the year. We then will take that in the middle of the year, and we'll take it at the end of the year. So while we're seeing growth along the year, it also gives our teachers an indication, what are those areas which we're seeing where we may need to curriculum compact for those students that are achieving at a high level, and what scaffolds do we need to put in place so we know they have entry points previous to the end of the year. Text-dependent analysis. This is a heavy slide, but it's also the most weighted portion of any assessment the students participate in for the state. It's a rubric of 1 to 4, but every area is multiplied by 4. A perfect score is 16 out of 16. And in what was really impressive is over 50% of the total grade 4 student population, which is the first year that text-dependent analysis is on the assessment, slightly over 50% scored a proficient or advanced score, with 15% of the students, they achieved a perfect score. We then see that in grade 5, where they're consistent in terms of the 47% achieving a proficient or advanced score, and 10% of the students achieving a perfect score. We then see this decrease from grade 5 to 6, and that's an area we are looking for from improvement. What may be that switch? Where do we need to lean in on in terms of instruction and curriculum? Overall, we are using those PLCs communities to analyze these discrete differences. We're looking, as we talked about, looking backward and forward. What do we do in 3rd grade as well to maybe get to that analysis sooner? On the state assessment, there's Part A, Part B questions. One is reliant on the other. That begins in 3rd grade. So we've begun to, in 2nd grade, as the year progresses, to start to expose them to that interdependent thinking with analysis. So those are the things that we're doing as we dig deeper into the possible root causes of the data. And I'll turn it over to Mrs. Lauren Hopkins.
Good morning. So moving into the 7th grade ELA PSSA, again, you're going to see a lot of consistency. I know it was the word I used last year, it's the word we used to describe the state, and it's the word that we're using again this year, because really you see some, as Dory mentioned, you see some growth, some slight decreases, but it is generally, our scores are remaining very consistent across English language arts. So we are trending up. We are back to our pre-pandemic levels of proficiency in 7th grade. You will see a slight decline in both our African American and multiracial subgroups, but despite those declines, we are still consistent in those subgroups with our trending of approximately 30% above the state levels. So even though those groups dropped slightly, we are still seeing 30% proficiency above what we're seeing at the state level. And, Jason and Dory both talked a little bit about cohort growth. Those two groups of students did grow from 6th grade into 7th grade. So we saw growth across the cohort in those areas. You also see growth in 7th grade across our Hispanic, Asian, and economically disadvantaged subgroups. So again, we see small changes here and there, but for the most part, we are remaining consistent in our scores. If you go to the next slide, please. 8th grade is very similar. So again, we are back to our pre-pandemic levels of proficiency. We are very consistent. If you take a look at our Hispanic, multiracial, and economically disadvantaged subgroups, they did decrease this year after seeing significant increases last year. So they are still performing above where they were, both pre-pandemic and in 2021. So we saw a lot of growth last year, which tapered off a little bit this year with some slight decreases. But we also see some significant growth within our Asian subgroup as well there. So this is one of the places where we are focusing moving forward, really is looking at some of our 8th grade curriculum and some of our instructional practices to see how we can make some positive changes at the 8th grade level in particular. Next slide, please. So again, our analysis shows consistency in scores both across time and across subgroups. One of the places where we see strength is the craft and structure and integration of knowledge and ideas. What that means really is looking at point of view, use of words, connections between and among texts. Another place where we see strength is vocabulary acquisition and use, which is really exactly what it says. It's how students use words, understand words, both literally and figuratively. So then if we look at where we can grow, in 7th grade, key ideas and details is a place where we really could see some growth across all of our groups. And so what that is in key ideas and details is really digging into the standards and eligible content. It's looking at evidence, theme, summary, character development, point of view, vocabulary analysis, and structure. So what our 7th grade teams did, and Nancy mentioned earlier that we have, an additional content lead this year. It's been really helpful to have a 7-8 point person in each of our 3 middle schools. So our content leads work very well together and also with the teachers on their teams. And 7th grade came together and asked if they could utilize the Common Lit Pro benchmark. And so they did give that assessment already. They gave it in September. And the beauty of that is that that fall passage that our students used, it's 3 passages with 20 questions each. All of those passages of the assessment that they took are aligned to the standards and the eligible content in this area. So our 7th grade teachers are already locally digging into where are our students doing well, where do our students need some support, and how can we utilize this data to inform our instruction. So they're working together as PLCs, not only within their buildings, but also across the 3 buildings. The middle school principals were gracious enough to find time where we can meet across buildings once a month. So we have that time built in to really provide that alignment across the buildings as well. From an 8th grade standpoint, conventions of standard English is a place where we can grow, and that is really like grammar, punctuation, writing. And so we do provide access to No Red Ink, and the 8th grade teachers decided to give that benchmark. They haven't yet given it, but it is something they are giving in the first semester, commonly across all 3 buildings. And that'll do really the same thing. It'll give us an idea of these are the places where our students are already strong, these are the places where they can grow, and they'll utilize that data in their PLCs to inform instruction and make sure that they're instructing in the right areas leading up to the next assessment. Dory talked about the TDA, the text-dependent analysis. This is a place where we can still continue to grow in 7th and 8th grade as well. The good news is last year our proficiency for grades 7 and 8 was 59% on the TDA at both grade levels. 7th grade this year was 63%, and 8th grade this year was 65%. So we did see some growth. We are going to continue to focus on that area. We provided professional development to teachers back in February. We had all 5 to 8 teachers together for a professional development session with an outside consultant. We did adjust our assessment so that Dory talked about that Part A, Part B. We added the multiple choice portion, which students were not doing before. They were just doing the written portion. So we added the multiple choice portion to the assessment, which includes Part A, Part B questions. And we also adjusted the assessment windows. So last year we were giving a TDA in October and March, and then they were taking the PSSA in May. This year, we gave the first one in October, we'll give the second one in January, and then they'll take the PSSA in May. So that gives teachers time to see the growth from October to January and also still be able to turn around their instruction and provide additional instruction after that second TDA before they head into the PSSA in May. So that is a picture of grades 7 and 8. On the next slide, please, that's our Keystone first-time test takers, proficiency in advanced. And again, you'll see we're very consistent. We are we're right back where we were before the pandemic. Just about, we were at 90%, we're at 89, so we're right back where we should be, where we started. We do see some statistically insignificant drops with our African-American subgroup, our multiracial subgroup, Asian, and also economically disadvantaged subgroups, but we do see significant growth with our Hispanic subgroup. So we are, again, digging into this data and working with teachers to inform instruction both at the 9th grade and the 10th grade levels. Students take this exam at the end of 10th grade. So if you go to the next slide, please. Again, you see consistency. We did see this year an increase in our number of students who are scoring in the advanced range. Last year, we had 27% of our students scoring advanced. This year, we saw 34% of our students scoring advanced. So we were able to provide some growth towards the top end as well and move some of our students up, grow them towards the advanced range. The interesting part about our Keystone exam is that our areas of strength are in the analyzing and interpreting literature, both in the fiction and the nonfiction. And that stands out a little bit because where we can grow is reading for meaning. And you would think that students need to be able to read for meaning in order to analyze and interpret it. So in talking with some of our teachers, they acknowledge that they sometimes kind of skip over that part a little bit and jump right into the analysis, because we are trying to develop critical readers, thinkers, writers. So we've had conversations within the PLCs about how to, make sure that we are still hitting on that reading for meaning and making sure that students understand the meaning before jumping into all of the analysis without taking away from any of the analytical instruction, because clearly we're doing a very good job there. So one of the things we implemented this year across the board is common assessments. So we have our teachers working together in their PLCs, not only to develop the common assessments, but once they are developed, they'll be giving one in the fall semester and one in the spring semester, and then utilizing that data, again, cross-building, so both Lower Merion and Harriton, looking at that data and determining the best way to utilize that instruction, or that data to inform their instruction. 9th grade is also rewriting their curriculum this year, so one of the things that they are going to do is really dig into the standards and the eligible content and make sure that we are, as we analyze the priority standards and supporting standards as we rewrite the curriculum, making sure that we're hitting upon the eligible content that we need to ensure that we're providing opportunities for students to grow in their performance, not only on the Keystone exam, but also just in general. So that is something that we are going to focus on as we continue to move forward with the curriculum. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Gaudioso.
Thank you. So good morning. So I have the pleasure of highlighting key takeaways. When we have data presentations, sometimes it can feel like we're looking at lots and lots of numbers. But what I hope stood out to you is the good news that each of our supervisors was sharing in terms of strengths, but also really critical, thoughtful consideration and planning of next steps. So in terms of key takeaways, our mathematics achievement scores have increased in all grades with statistically significant increases by grade level in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8. Science achievement scores increased significantly in 8th grade. Similar to national trends, math achievement has rebounded and grown at a more accelerated rate post-pandemic than ELA. The gap with economically disadvantaged students and/or African-American students continues to be the largest across all tests. However, the district has seen achievement growth on these tests, but as you heard across all of our supervisors, remains an area of focus and a commitment on the part of all the leaders in the district. So the achievement gap in ELA is less pronounced than in mathematics and continues to be an area of focus. While our ELA achievement scores remain consistent overall, growth remains a focus. Text-dependent analysis is an area of growth across all ELA tested grades, and you just heard about some of those next steps related to that. So next slide, please. So one thing that's important to think about is you heard all of that data reported by subject area. But when we think about our district as a system, it's really important to think of all of the many systems within a school district that support students. And we need to improve those systems, part of a continuous improvement model, but also as part of a multi-tiered systems of support framework. And you heard that mentioned at the beginning. And when we think about the multiple systems focused on supporting a whole child, and when we think about how those systems increase in their supports to meet the emerging needs of students, you can picture tiers or steps of those supports increasing. And that's a way of thinking about all that we do to support students in that framework of multi-tiered systems of support. It's been a district focus area. We're in the third year of implementation, much of which is grounded in analyzing and effectively responding to data. But that data goes beyond just the PSSA data that you just heard, and it goes beyond other classroom learning assessment data. It also goes to the curriculum data that the supervisors were sharing with you about what are we learning about our programs and our practices. And you heard Dr. Lilly say repeatedly what the delivery of instruction looks like in the classroom. So it really needs to be a comprehensive look when we are thinking about improving our systems and practices. So when you saw that funneling slide on the beginning, the entire funnel on that slide represents the data processes or systems of MTSS, as well as the end work to problem solve and identify supports for students. Our supervisors talked about using this and other data to dig deeper into what the subject area next steps are to support individual students, but also to grow the systems that support students. And some of that includes curricular or assessment revision, data practices, collaboration practices such as professional learning communities, and as well as development in specific areas, all of which falls under infrastructure building. So this is a slide that we use internally as we're talking about what are our goals for MTSS each year, and you can see the progression as we've moved from year 1 to 2 to 3. And infrastructure is powerful. It's really, really comprehensive, and it's really, really critical to the work. So when we think about all of the data that was shared in sort of for lack of a better word, silos of content area information, it lives within a broader context that really is across systems and across all members of our school community. So there are educational terms up here shared to give a glimpse into what it means to use data to ask questions to improve a system, in addition to target individual student needs. Each of these areas of infrastructure listed is part of a progression of system improvements in support of student learning. So the next slide is going to highlight some district-wide infrastructure focus this year that is really important in ensuring we can increase our ability to effectively respond to information about student learning, whether it's curricular information as we're learning where our program can perhaps change delivery of instruction, or whether we're looking at student needs. So in terms of digging deeper, and that language is actually a term we use, but it's also part of a state tool that helps us look more closely at data. But here I'm going to talk about a couple priority areas, one of which is a reboot or reintroduction or introduction of the PLC structure at schools. And PLC stands for Professional Learning Communities, and PLCs are supposed to be action-oriented, focused on data, that is used to improve student learning, right? And when you have grade level PLCs, and the training for PLCs probably began about at least 10 years ago in the district. Pre-pandemic, we've had a lot of turnover change, and a lot of times groups coming together to meet may name something a PLC when it really isn't focused on those critical elements, those 4 questions of a PLC that are anchored in data and focused on improving practice and student learning. So this is a refresh year for PLCs, and as you heard each of the supervisors talking, when we're doing the work at the district level and looking at the data, maybe changing curriculum, the points of intersection across our system are profound and really complex. And that includes connecting with teachers and PLCs, connecting with our leadership team on next steps to really to supervise and coach teachers. We're looking at our assessments. So when you see universal screeners, introducing screeners in areas where they are currently non-existent, these are things that help us look at individual student needs as they're entering experiences. So a universal screener can be a a targeted tool. For example, what we use in elementary literacy is called Dibbles. It can sometimes be a practice when you're at the secondary level, and you may not be able to administer a screener like that to all students. We may look at something that's more of a dashboard approach as a screening tool, where we're looking at, for example, student core performance or performance in core programs in ninth grade, attendance, behavior. So you have screening practices as well. And we're also looking at, for example, in math, how can we use tools differently that may have existed previously and use them more diagnostically and as a screener so that we can look at student needs and plan PLC work and anchor all of those next steps that you heard our supervisors talking about, anchor them so that we are aligned with our systems and we're really intersecting in powerful ways that both empower teachers and strengthen our system. So the creation of common assessments is a focus. Every content area at the secondary level where they didn't previously exist, that is a focus area for this year, and it is tied to PLC practices. It's going to inform data teams. It's going to inform the team-initiated problem solving that you heard a lot about last year as we worked on our data practices. So these assessments are going to strengthen our ability to really look thoughtfully at where students are, what they need from us, and how we can improve our delivery of instruction. One exciting focus area for this year, Dr. Yanni just met with our whole team on beginning instructional rounds with building administrators, which is exciting. And this will build the capacity of our leadership team to really calibrate our understanding of best practices, what we're seeing, how we're seeing instructional delivery, and where we see opportunities to coach in and really be part of the systemic or system level improvements that each of our curricular supervisors are seeing as areas of strength and growth. It puts us all on the same team, on the same as one team, and on the same page, really moving the system forward toward these goals. So you heard a lot of data, but there's a lot that we do with it. Even though this is one data point among many, it's a nice anchor for us to take a snapshot of our district at this time. So I'll end there.
So our growth data just came out. In the winter time, we'll come back and talk about growth data, because remember, we have not only just achievement data, but we get growth data from the state. As a cursory look, it looks good overall. You know, some red, some blue, but definitely because you can see the achievement scores as they are, that a lot of times leads you to growth, even though it's based on the cohorts, it still would hold true. So you'll see that coming soon. And then we'll also come back with district level data, because this is one piece of everything that we do. And it's really just a culmination. We're not teaching to get these scores. We're teaching to our standards, our eligible content, and assessing throughout the school year using both summative, which may happen across buildings, and formative, which is really just snapshots in the classroom to help us know how students are doing and are they learning what we're teaching, right? Do we have any flaws in our system? And so we'll come back and we'll give you district level data as well coming into the winter time. So yeah, for a bigger picture of what happens. Questions at this point?
I just wanted to start out and say that I thought this presentation was really, really informative and very well done, that I know we had a little confusion around this presentation last year, and that like it was very clear that a lot of work went into restructuring this in a really comprehensive way that gave a lot of background and a lot of what's going on, what we're doing going forward, and I really appreciated that. So I will, does anybody else on my team want to ask some questions?
We all have 30 questions.
Okay, who would like to go first? Dave, why don't you go first?
We're just going to say that out loud.
Yeah, I echo the comment. I mean, it was a very informative presentation with tremendous amount of data. Tough to understand all of it, but I just want to focus for a second on the math, the elementary math. Obviously, it went from 2015 to 2019. When I was on the board, basically the same discussion, the same gaps. We did address relentlessly, you know, on-ramps, off-ramps, middle school curriculum, change it. And I always thought, I should preface, I have a comment and then a question. But my comment is basically that I always felt that fundamentally, you know, math doesn't change, just the way we teach it changes. And we've changed it year in, year out, a lot of times to address the achievement gap. I even believe, if I memory serves, that going to integrated math, that was part of the premise to go forward with integrated math. As we can see from this data and from what I recall from the data even from 10 years ago, the achievement gap between the African American and the economic disadvantage hasn't really moved moved the needle much. And my question is, I think one, it points out the need for full-day kindergarten in particular. And another concept that I know it's not school district-wide, but is I think the earlier intervention, the better, even pre-K. When I was growing up, Project Head Start, things like that. But one of the things that I was concerned about, and you raised it with regard to the multiplication and division tables, was that basically I don't believe once there's a gap in middle school, as fifth grade or sixth grade, it's not going to change, because you need to have a fundamental understanding or fundamental multiplication, addition, subtraction, division tables cold before you can even try to tackle algebra, geometry, or any higher level math. And if you don't have that, then you're never going to get it. And so my question is, what's happening in terms of teaching those fundamental, basic, rote math, arithmetic concepts? And are we using calculators in elementary school? And I know my kids had them, and I think that's really, they shouldn't be. But anyway, that's sort of my question.
So those were actually areas of strength on PSSA this past year. Multiplication, division in third grade, our whole number operations, and facts in fourth and fifth grade. So they were actually areas of strength this year. We've been working on those with conceptual understanding. As for the calculators, they are introduced in grade 4, but only students use those to solve complex word problems. So they're allowed to use calculators on the PSSA. If the students don't know what to do with that tool, it's not useful to them. So they have to know if it's a multi-step problem, I need to add and subtract and divide. So it's a tool to solve the problem. If they don't know the steps, the tool is no good to them. So they do not have the tool to do basic operations. There's a place for calculators, and it's not to solve problems that they can do mentally or paper and pencil. So, we talk to the teachers, we have PD on the calculator when that is to be introduced, when it's useful to students, when students should use those. So there is a place and time for the calculator in fourth and fifth grade.
Thank you.
Good.
All right.
Who wants to go next? Okay, Curry, go ahead.
Thanks. So first of all, great, you should all be proud of yourself. Start there. But when I look at data, I look at the other side of it, because a lot of what we talk about here, and you guys weaved in with the digging deeper, the other side of it a bit, but I want to unpack that a little bit more and understand how you're analyzing that and kind of how you're digging into it. Side note, I completely agree about calculators. If you don't have the concept of value and the concept of amounts, you can't really use a calculator. I actually don't mind calculators if you have those concepts locked in, but I do like a good figure it out in your head problem too. I'm that person that loves math, so we go there. Okay, real quick, just for, if people are comparing these to last year or previous years, this is the first year we didn't have a penalty. Please explain to all of us that what is a penalty and how, if it does, because I'm not sure about if it's a how, affect the data that we're seeing. So was there a penalty on last year's data, therefore it looked lower than it should have been? I don't understand penalty, even though you explained it. This is probably year 3 for me, I'm not sure.
So it's changed a little bit each year. With the Future Ready Index, you're granted a number of points. So it doesn't necessarily change the data, but we won't be dinged on that. So when state rankings come out, when our Future Ready Index dashboard is up, you won't see us dinged for that this year. So also, what makes me feel better, the greater percentage of kids we have taking the assessments means the greater reliability of the scores, right? So when you look over the last couple of years, we've seen that percentage go up. So I think the more kids we have taking the assessment, the better we can,
Rely on it.
Rely on the scores.
Yeah, so we'll see that ding in the next data presentation. Am I getting that correct?
There won't be one.
There won't
No,
be
there
one.
won't be one, but comparable dings from last year and not from this year.
The only ding is it marks you down on the performance profile. It doesn't, there's no.
Got it, okay.
numeric.
I thought we talked about, the reason I'm bringing it up is I swore we talked about this year, that it skews the data just a tad bit, and that's the reason why I'm Just want to be clear.
The statewide trend for opt-outs in previous years, I know in my previous two districts, when you look at who is opting out, which brings your percentage down, typically they are stronger performers. So that is what skews the data a little
Okay.
bit.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Couple of things I really want to focus on. It's definitely ELA, but math was a little bit more. What I want to understand is the students that fall below proficient, all that gap, and how are we analyzing those students based on cohorts, based on race, and are we taking that data specifically and looking at the digging deepers in that realm alone? Because just because they did great in calculations, that's a skew of the overall kids that took the test. That does not mean that's the same behavior. It can and it cannot mean that it's the same behavior and the same needs of these kids. And also going back to your comment about what you need to do, and if you don't get it by a certain grade, we don't always represent curriculum for those kids in particular. So are we analyzing that data to understand if our instruction and our curriculum is supporting what their specific needs are? There. We'll do math.
Well, it doesn't matter which subject you're talking about,
Good.
right? Because we do the same thing. So I put the data funnel back up for a reason, right? So we're presenting district level data, which doesn't drill all the way down to the individual level. But Dr. Gaudioso and I meet with every building administrator in the district, and they have to do a building level learning plan in addition to all the other goals that they set. The first part of the building level learning plan is the district stuff that you're hearing right now. The second part is that line where you see the building there, right? And it gets into grade level, it gets into subgroups, it gets into classrooms, and then there's even a section at the end of it that's about individual.
Yeah, I heard that. I actually thought Dr. Gaudioso did a great job on saying like how you do the individual, the classroom. Like I totally heard that. What I'm asking is at the higher level, the district level, are we analyzing the data on the other side? So all of this data focuses on proficient and above and where we are, or the whole entire cohort. Are we specifically, I want the other report. I asked for that. We talked about this last year too. I want to know what trends and what patterns and what understanding can we get when we just analyze the data on the below proficient? Everything that falls in the below.
We are doing that. We do both. And I know Dory's like chomping to talk about it, but we look at our students who are below proficient. And we don't just do for PSSAs, right? We do it for other assessments as well. So like we'll talk about DIBELS, right? DIBELS gives us students that we know are below our benchmark. We are focused on those individual students and what are we going to do to grow those
I get
students?
that.
So we are looking below.
I'm talking about this test, not DIBELS, not any other test, this test
But it
alone.
aligns. We don't just look at one test because you have to look at one test.
I
Right,
understand.
no, but just follow me along. We look at the test and look at the students that are below and know where we have to focus. But we want to make sure that it actually aligns with other data points as well.
No, and I understand that, and that's good. You should be doing that. One test doesn't tell you everything. But when we look at this presentation and we go to slide, pick any slide that talks about digging deeper. Do we have that same slide for just the data points from this test for the kids below?
Who wants-
So we don't have the slide, we have the information.
Yeah.
So what we do is the questions we ask, which are in support of the building level process, is who are these students, first off? We want to know beyond these numbers on this state test because they're more than this number on this state assessment. You heard Dr. Gaudioso say the whole child. So when we look at these assessments, we ask a lot of questions in terms of historical data. When did they enter our district? Have they been in our district the whole time? Is this the first time? We're saying it because it is the first state test in grade 3.
Yeah.
So were there indicators along the way? And when there were, what did we do in terms of interventions and support to enable them to get to this point? The idea that this is an achievement test over growth, all of those other things are interdependent, because if a student came into our district, let's just say in first grade without kindergarten, you mentioned the importance of early literacy and math fluency, we now have to double up some time. And we need to try to get them in addition to. So you may not see that growth in third grade. You may not see it. You won't see the achievement. We're going to see the growth. And our goal is over time for them to both line up. So do we look at that? We do. And then we have conversations with our literacy specialists, our math specialists, with our administrators, and we talk about what are the things we can do for them to grow and learn, what are the appropriate entry points. In our curriculum documents, we have increased, I would say, the scaffolds and the enrichment, because as much as we want to say we do focus on the below basic and basic, our other question is also how are we moving those students that are coming in proficient and we want them to grow to advance? How are we challenging our most advanced students so that they continue to learn as well? That impacts instructional practice where we're looking at differentiated instruction. So what are the things we can do in the classroom so that we're honoring the needs of all students? So if you were to say, do we have information? We have individual and cohort information that we look at closely and have conversations within the buildings and with building level teams to say, how can we? And what are the other areas of influence, which goes into PBIS and the emotional, social, behavioral, because we need to get that sense of belonging and make sure that they're emotionally succeeding as well in our classroom, and then also address the achievement. So that's the degree we go down to that, and it
Yeah.
would become an individual conversation versus an overall number on a slide.
Yeah, great. And I have two follow-up questions on that. You go
A follow-up
first.
question on that is just to make sure that I'm understanding both the question and the answer. So when we're talking about areas of growth and areas of strength, is that for all of the students, or is there also a separate analysis of area of growth and where the needs are of the people, of the students that are just in the basic and below basic area, as opposed to this is the overall student need?
Yep.
That's a great question. We love these questions. Well,
That was the.
it is true. We have to, depending upon the data that we're analyzing, we ask the same questions, but it may look differently. So I'll use the ELA example of sixth grade, when we noticed the flip in the below basic and basic. We have to dig deeply into why did that happen? Who are those students? What were they doing in fifth grade in terms of that area that was measured, and what are those areas where we're seeing that? We also have to be mindful in these assessments when we look at these numbers of test design. I know there are certain questions or standards area where there might be 3 questions, and that's where we go into curriculum to say, were we providing intense interventions to get the growth in this early fluency versus the 3 questions of integration of ideas and analysis, which is high level. So we go that deeply, even for all of those students, because the interventions are going to look different.
And that's exactly the question I was asking, because the interventions for the whole data review are not always the interventions for the cohort that falls here. I'm assuming the same thing happens in math. The question I have to follow up with that, and then I'll ping it over to you, is have we noticed different patterns in those below basic and below basic cohorts that we can say, here are some of the factors that we're seeing that create this? Because as a community, if we understand what some of those factors are at play, then we can prioritize that as a school district moving for the next 10 years forward. But I don't know if you want to jump in first.
Yeah, I think that.
So I'll offer a couple points. If students are not reading on or above grade level, their chances of being proficient are cut in half. So we have to look at how we're actually teaching reading, right?
On a grade level by, is there a by point? Like by third grade, then we have this issue?
Oh, yes. Okay, so overall, if kids aren't reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3, making up that ground is very, very difficult. So one of the things that the district did in response to kids that were not reaching levels of proficiency, we have a more structured literacy program, putting in foundations. When we look at data, I was sitting with Dory and a couple of teachers last week. We noticed that our elementary students are doing really well with text-dependent analysis questions. We're not seeing that with our secondary students when they make that switch from 4th grade to 5th grade. So the conversation, to your question, was about what are we seeing with the kids that were basic or below basic on that part of the assessment? And so are we noticing that kids they don't understand the question, that they're not providing textual evidence, that they're not citing text, that they're not analyzing? And so teachers were actually drilling down so that they could make changes not only for those kids, but if we do better by the kids that aren't reaching proficiency, we're absolutely improving instruction for everyone. It's universal design for learning, right? And so that's the level of analysis. So I think when we present this at the Education Committee, I think what we can do is talk about the highlights from each of the data pieces, but focus more intently on what are the trends that we're seeing with the kids that aren't getting over the line of proficiency, and what are we doing around that with the idea that when you increase the tides, all ships will rise.
Yep.
Fair?
Yeah, is exactly what I was trying to understand, because that's, yeah, you raise your baseline, everybody's good. And it gets back to the point that we're helping kids along the way with more needs of what can we really put into practice. Okay, a couple other questions. So how do so this is kind of more of a bigger question on this, especially I think in math is where my question is targeted. So how do these lower scores for our African-American and our economically disadvantaged students affect them in the long-term gain of having the choices and the desire to go into, say, the sciences? You can't get into a great college for biology or for environmental sciences when your math scores are low in the beginning, and then you don't have the ability to be exposed to the higher level math, and then you can't track and trend towards that. So in some ways, what Dory was talking about was tracking and trending kids in a healthy, good way. But on the other side of that, this seems like we're cutting out an entire group of kids, not intentionally, but that we're looking at data that will tell us that an entire group of kids don't have the opportunities that the other kids do to have these choices as adults and in life. So what can you tell us about these patterns that we're seeing in the gaps between third grade math, depending on your race?
I'll start, and then I'm sure others will jump in. So when you look at our trends on the math PSSA, where some of our student subgroups start to fall down is in the written expression for math. So computation is okay, problem solving is okay, but when they have to write out their thinking and make their thinking visible, that's where they start to really fall down. So what we need to do a better job of is actually teaching kids how to write that constructed response to math problems. And that to me is not teaching to the test. That's actually giving the teacher a view into the student's thinking. Because when they're writing out their procedural steps or they're explaining how they arrived at an answer, we're going to be much better able to understand, is the student having a computation problem? Does the student not understand the problem? Where is it that we need to provide intervention? There is a strong link between kids that are performing low in reading. They don't perform well on the math assessment because they have to fight through the text to answer questions. What we need to dig into more across the entire state is, why do those same kids do well on the fourth grade science test? Because the fourth grade science test is largely a reading test. It's not necessarily a science test. So that's something that we have a think tank across the state working on. So how do they fall down on reading, fall down on math? Like, how are you basic or below basic on these two assessments, but then proficient or advanced over on the science assessment?
And what's the curriculum and behaviors in those classrooms that instigate that better score, but then you can then modify into the other classrooms? Do you have a follow-up on that? And then I
just have more of a thought question, and it goes back to that idea of test design. That almost seems to me that that's a test design question, even more than an individual student.
Because science, the background knowledge that you bring, the science content has been the same. Science, for the science assessment, what we were saying is that assessment has remained the same. So there's the background knowledge that is necessary to bring to that reading, which increases your comprehension, has been taught year after year after year after year after year. The assessment hasn't changed in 15 years. However, you get into math or you get into literacy assessment, your background knowledge, and we talk about certain subgroups, your background knowledge plays a significant part in the understanding you bring and the level of comprehension that's going to follow. Especially, we're trying to improve upon, as Dr. Yanni stated, the academic terminology that's integrated across literacy and math. It matters because there's different meanings for specific words. So that we come across that, and culturally how that word was used. So when we look into these little nuances, and I mentioned test design, is there are slight biases when you get into, if I never visited an apple orchard and I'm now reading about an apple orchard, and we might have not exposed that in the curriculum, that will play a part in what shows through in the comprehension. So.
And it goes back to the value, like you can't use a calculator if you don't know greater and less than, like things like that. Like you have to understand those values of math. The last question that I have on this, and this is like a more particular one after that bigger one that I just gave, unless you wanted to add anything in on the math kind of question overall that.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it goes back to Dave's point, is that the early learning is critical to future success. And we named third grade with ELA, but math really isn't different. It builds year over year, and those foundational skills are what set the stage for future success. We have been talking across the district about how do we navigate new students to the district. That's a challenge we have. Typically, in more instances than not, when students come to our district, they are not at the same place our students are at who have been here historically all the way through. So we're talking about putting some kind of assessments in place, really assessing the skills of our new move-in students, and then figuring out exactly how can we provide specific interventions, targeted interventions aligned with their specific needs, because they're brand new to us. Really getting to know their strengths and challenges is important for us to be able to meet those needs. So that's something we're looking at. We've talked about, you asked questions about that the students who aren't successful. It's one of the things that we've talked about digging into is, have those students been here all the way through, or are those students, were they new, and what year were they new? Because there might be a year, like I said, third grade, there might be a specific year. We know there's certain years we get a lot of move-in students, depending when they finish other places. So are there things happening in those specific years that we could address right away and then hopefully see results later on that we've built up those skills in advance?
Exactly, looking for patterns so then we can say, how do we mitigate it? How do we mitigate it before it gets to a. So my last two things will just be like a comment real quick, because I know we're short of time. There's slide 34, you guys talked about common assessments across buildings, Harrington and Lower Merion with math. I think that's really helpful because then you can compare what's working, what's not with the students that we have and what's the differences and the similarities. Because I think this was the report we looked at last year based by school. And we saw some big differences based by school, a different way. It might have been a different report, but I think that's helpful because then teachers can see, oh, we have similar students, but we're not having this problem. So the same thing on a positive side, we're not having this problem. What are you doing that's actually making it click? And we can steal that because that's all education does is steal good ideas from each other. So I think that's great and broader. But what I've heard over and over and over again, and we all know this in education, exposure matters. And I think that's not just about the kids that are in the K+ program, but all kids being exposed early on to better and more high quality literacy and math materials in a full day kindergarten program. So just hearing it, we know exposure matters, exposure to tests, exposure to beam patterns, vocabulary, extensive use of it. That's what matters in education. Okay, thanks. I'm done. You, Mel, anybody else? Sorry.
Mel, you go.
Hi, thanks. A lot of stuff going on, and I'm trying to pull out what my questions have already been asked. And so, so I appreciate all this data and all that, and that you are looking at it in a more cohesive event. I have to say, I still would love to see this is basically, we're talking about standardized testing. And we know that from evidence-based research that standardized testing has never been good for Black students. and educate economically disadvantaged students. So one question I have is how much standardized testing is going on in the classroom? And what are the best practices of every classroom that when a student gets something wrong on their test, are all teachers having them go back and correct that test and understand what they didn't understand on that test so that they actually come away with the knowledge to carry through and be motivated with getting things correctly, understanding what they did wrong and being able to correct it and understand how to move forward and do better in the future.
And I'll answer for math. So I know after a benchmark assessment or unit tests, teachers get the data, they look at individual students, they look at questions that possibly it was a trend in the grade level or a trend in their class. And that might be something they have to go back to and review with the entire class. There might be small groups of students who got certain questions incorrect or had some misconceptions about it, and they meet with those small groups of students and maybe a guided math group and go over those questions with them and conference with those students. So that is happening. At the middle level, the teachers are having students make corrections, reteaching, reassessing, giving students the opportunity to make corrections on those assessments. So that is happening. And I can only speak to the K to 6 level.
I'll piggyback for literacy at the elementary level. So conferencing is key, and it's more that metacognition of that self-assessment, because we want to empower the learner. So it is an area in ELA as we move on and we move up. I'm going to talk about 6th grade because it's a conversation we had specifically in 6th grade that needs to be built into the pacing guides. It needs to be that intentional and deliberate that we build this space to have those vital conversations, not so much about the score, but about the process. And we've made shifts in terms of focusing on process versus product. So even in 1st grade, when I talked about that alignment with the narratives, we have a rubric. So it used to be we use the state rubric, and we give the narrative at the end of the year, and we score it. And now what we're doing is we're giving the narrative, but we've created a rubric for where are they in process, and do they understand that? Even in 1st grade, having those conversations. So let's see, can you see how many sentences do you have? Where are those sentences? It's a lot of questioning, but it's putting the onus of the learning more on the student early on in a very nurturing type of environment. That also will lead into 2nd grade. So at the end of the year, when they revisit narrative, it's done with the state rubric, and then we can see that growth along the way. It is an area, I think it's a wonderful question. It's an area of growth and improvement because our kids do so well. We sometimes, to your point, need to step back and say, hey, let's find out even further why, because students will they'll be honest. I really didn't know what that question was asking me as a learner. What part of the question didn't you understand? Why didn't I understand that word? Encounter. So now we know what is really truly causing it. So thank you for the question, and it's an area we're focusing.
And I'm sorry. That's a piece that Dory brought up, putting that actually in the pacing guide. That's something that's not necessarily standard or innate at the secondary level, right? So it's really part of an elementary practice. It's part of a middle school practice. We have to spread that practice all the way through graduation, because unless we are helping kids understand who they are as learners and where their strengths, but where their areas of opportunities are, you can't make any growth if you don't actually have that conversation to say, I notice on this essay, you basically retold the piece of literature. You didn't really synthesize, you didn't really analyze. And so that idea of second chance learning and being focused less on a grade, but more on the process of learning, right? Ultimately, we have to build that into our secondary schedule and build our secondary mindset.
Yeah, I've heard complaints from students and at the secondary level because they'll do a lot of peer review and they say they don't really get much out of the peer review. And then they get just told, well, you need to do better in your writing, and they don't really understand, well, how do I do better? So taking that step back, like you're talking about, to help them really understand, especially for the neurodiverse group who sometimes inference can be a lot of problems in analysis, and also reading being more a little bit more you have to learn it a certain way, and then it's presented to you a different way in a question or on an exam, and you're like, they didn't, even though they understood the concept and how to do it, it was asked in a different way that they just couldn't interpret it. So I appreciate that. And one comment before, when we're talking about the tracking and trending and motivation of students, I've heard so many kids say that with challenged students, they see them get that special treatment and they feel excluded, and that they need to be the motivated and not forgotten about. And I wondered if that would help with getting her scores up for some of the where the lower sections are.
So really two big points around this. We've started to have a lot of conversations this year around course placement. And I really have an aversion to using state assessment data as really carrying much weight in that selection process, right? Because we have to look at how a student does across the entire year. The whole philosophy of strengths-based education, if we're only providing remediation for kids that aren't getting it, we're not accelerating their learning at all. And so on some level, we need to do acceleration and enrichment for all students. If we don't do that, right? So we have parallel math classes or math remediation, and when you look not just over a 1-year period, but when you look at decades of research, just putting kids in low levels and trying to remediate them doesn't produce any result. So we have to take that model of enrichment and provide that opportunity. And so if we start to be really flexible with our day, and we have I&E time, we have win time, we have lunch and learn, if we look at those times during the day to build on our students' strengths, that's how I think we're going to be able to leverage those opportunities to move kids along. Because you might struggle with a concept or with multiple concepts, but in between those concepts, you have some really great bright spots that we can build on. And especially around math. I was never a good math student. It wasn't until I had a teacher that saw some bright spots in me and started to attach new learning to where I already had the bright spot that made me feel confident.
I just wanted to really quickly echo the conversation we had in the equity committee about, negative bias. And I think it's exactly what you said, high expectations, see where your strengths are, and then build on it. And that's for every student. We're not just targeting our tops and our bottoms. We're targeting all of our students, but we're giving them those two things. We know you can hit it here, whatever your here is, and we're going to make sure you get there because everybody has growth. But that's exactly the flip of that conversation was in the equity committee, that we also look at the positive. We also focus in on the strengths and look for areas of growth and not just constantly hound in on how far behind they are or where they're messing up. So it's kind of echoing.
Actually, I do have one quick question that's just more of an umbrella question. As we see them, we have economically disadvantaged and we have multiracial. Now, those two groups can fall into other categories. I just want to confirm that I'm assuming correctly that it's an order of precedent, that if they fall into the multi-level category, they state that's where they're counted and they're not going into more than one category.
There's actually intersectionality. So you could be in any other subgroup and in economically disadvantaged as well. The way that the state pulls the data.
So they may be double counted in different categories.
They could be, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that's why, we wouldn't, when we look by building, the reason we don't present, the reason I don't like to present disaggregated data by building is because sometimes those cohorts get really small, and then we could be inadvertently identifying individual students. But even within the economically disadvantaged subgroup inside a building, we have to look inside that subgroup and say, what is the makeup of that subgroup, and why are some students in that economically disadvantaged subgroup really excelling, and why are some not?
Lucy, did you have anything you wanted to hit, or should I go first and you can think about it? Okay, so mine sort of piggybacks on that. I would like to hear a little bit about how our English language learners, our SLIFE students, and our special ed students, how their testing works, how their preparation for their testing works, and how we're sort of integrating them into all of these other supports and analyses that we've been discussing this whole meeting.
So that's multi-layered. So SLIFEs, obviously, we need to, if they're newcomers, they don't participate right away necessarily in state assessment. So we have the WIDA Access, we have the WIDA Screener. There's a state level equivalent for our EL learners that is similar to the PSSA. When they get to a specific level that they are able to take the state assessment, they are counted into this. It is a subgroup where we can look to how do they perform on the state assessment. That is a subgroup where we can disaggregate. In terms of how do we, and I just want to be clear, I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, I
from
just
a
want to say,
curriculum
so
instructional-
English language learners have to hit a level of English proficiency before
So
they're
it's-
taken and
Well,
counted?
it's the
into
amount of time they're here, and then even though they may not be where you would think they could, we know they're not performing at the academic level that maybe they'd be successful like any other student, they would take the state assessment.
Right.
The one thing is when newcomers first come in, they may not have to take it that first year.
Okay.
And then you mentioned special education, so that's a unique.
Mr. Marta has a,
Yeah.
oh, just ELA, so.
Yeah.
No, the first year for all tests, they don't have to take. A brand new one? I didn't think it was just ELA.
They can, depending, you know, if they start in September.
They
will
can.
sit for math and science.
And science as well?
Yeah,
Oh.
so I apologize, I'm speaking EL.
ELA, the first 12 months of their.
Interesting. That seems sort of
Right.
counterintuitive. I know that I would probably not be able to pass an 8th grade math exam in German, so.
Right.
But they don't have to, right? That's
Oh, they
what-
Yeah.
Right, so our
Right.
first year, they don't automatically for ELA. They're the ones we typically don't put that burden on a brand new, but in the second
Okay,
year,
so
they have to.
those would likely be
that's still-
opt-out students?
They're not opt-out, they just, well, we mark them as an ELL student.
Okay, but they would still then be taking that math test and that science
They don't
test? that-
have, in the first year only, they do not have to.
Wait, but you're saying something different than what Mr. Marta's saying, and I'm confused.
Nobody takes an ELA their first year, right?
Right.
But,
First 12 months.
right,
If they're newcomers, like.
Okay.
and then we decide for the other two.
State tells you they have to be tested.
Interesting. Okay, that seems like something that the state should be turned around about, because as we're talking about what a English comprehension test science is, that having somebody who's,
For what it's worth, there are stage versions of science.
okay, so that's, yeah, that's great for our Spanish students, Spanish-speaking students, but complicated for our other students.
And it doesn't go by level, right? So if we have a level one student who is virtually a non-speaker or could be a non-speaker, they're not necessarily excused from the assessment, right? So just because, like Joy said, it's not about the level of the student, whether they take the assessment or not.
And that could be
it's
included
difficult,
in our numbers as
just
well,
depending.
that,
Yeah,
Nope.
I just wanted to be clear too, because that was multi-layered, your question, in
Yes.
terms of what assessments, because they do take other assessments that aren't necessarily the
right.
PSSA.
Yeah, I was specifically thinking about these state level ones. I would imagine that for our district level, that we're slightly more accommodating. How are we prepping and analyzing our special ed students for taking these exams?
Actually, Ms. Frazier left.
So,
Sorry, I'm just, for Mr. Marta, I'm just wondering how we're prepping and then analyzing the performance of our special ed students for Keystones and PSSAs.
So unless students have significant disabilities and they qualify for the PASA, the alternative assessment, they have to take the regular PSSA or the Keystone. So one of the things that winds up happening, particularly if a student has a significant reading disability and they're reading many grade levels below level, they can get some accommodations for the math assessment where it can be read aloud. It's really difficult with the ELA assessment. When we instruct students in special education, it's really important to take a look at the grade level standard. So let's say it's a 4th grade student and the student is performing or has a disability that makes them perform below that grade level. We still have to focus on the 4th grade standard and look at all the prerequisite skills that make up that fourth grade standard so that kids are getting aligned instruction. We don't do test prep like some districts do. So we teach authentically. So when it comes to our special education students, it becomes really important to look at their progress monitoring and how they're doing according to their IEP goals, not just how they're doing, on these assessments.
I'm thinking particularly, and while this is particularly pertinent for special ed students, I think executive functioning is really important for all of our, I'm taking these notes. I still take my notes the way my seventh grade social studies teacher taught me to take notes. And I'm wondering how we're prepping our students for the process of taking a test. The sort of like synthesizing the skills we have in a classroom, and not just necessarily, yes, absolutely the standardized tests, but also the tests that our teachers are giving, because it's a skill.
So we definitely teach, and I've seen it already in practice this year, we definitely teach test-taking strategies, right? So talking to the text, annotating the text, taking a word problem, for example, in math and breaking it down, getting rid of extraneous words, rephrasing what the question is actually looking for, right? Because part of the process is to understand how to take the assessment. As we strengthen our data culture, not that we're going to teach the test, but we have to create more opportunities for students to see the types of questions that they're going to see on standardized tests, right? And understand that academic vocabulary. The main idea, for example, a question about main idea might ask about the main idea. It might ask for the point, the main point. It might ask for the central message. So we have to help kids become nimble and flexible with vocabulary. That becomes incredibly difficult with students with language-based disabilities because you have to develop them to be so highly proficient in one set of terminology, but we have to broaden that to help them understand what they're really being asked.
I'd argue also our non-neurotypical students as well, who
100%.
are like students with autism, students with ADHD,
Right.
that are really needing to drill down in that sort of stuff. And
Yep.
I like anything we're doing to prepare our students for the practical stuff of because yes, all the content is absolutely the reason we're here, but how to school, how to do, I know my fourth grader came home with an assignment book from school. Every kid in her class has that, and they're writing out their homework, and that sort of procedure stuff that sort of gets less scaffolded once we leave elementary school. I think the more that we can scaffold that through the higher level learning that we're doing as kids age is really going to prepare them for success in our schools and then success when they go on to being grown-ups.
And I think Lauren and I were.
Good, yes, I want to hear.
Well, the only reason we were both doing the same thing was because remember when we restructured fifth grade, we intentionally added in a study skills class for all of our fifth grade students to focus on executive functioning, knowing that transitional period as we go into the middle school, it's already hard, but it becomes harder, and the studying becomes different as we see students go up in our grade levels. And so we intentionally looked at our offerings for our unified arts and added in some at the middle level to shore up skills for students as they progress, so that hopefully by the time they leave us, they get to the high school, they feel more confident. But it was an intentional change.
That's really fantastic. And I think, I don't know that we have room in a day ever, but something like that for our freshmen and sophomores, or something that really prepare them for how to do high school, for that transition, for that increased level of work, the increased rigor of work, and then going on to not do what I did my freshman year of college and get there and be like, oh, you have to read every word of the textbook and know every single thing, and you have to keep on top of this, and you have to be there and not get I got my first C my freshman year of college, and I was stunned. And so it was just, I know that I didn't take coursework that sort of prepared me for that level of academic rigor. So I think as we can age that up with our students, that's really great. And I have one more very quick question. Are the content leads a separate position where that's their whole job, or is that like a designation for a teacher within the PLC?
It's actually a stipended position.
Great.
Like if you think of a department chair at the high school.
Right, like coaching a team or something.
Yeah, exactly, like helping to lead that department, helping to lead those grade levels, working with our content supervisors, but they have a full teaching load and then they get a stipend for it.
That's great. That sounds like ideal from both an HR perspective and an affording to be able to have those kinds of people to support that. Did anybody else have any other questions? Or Lucy, you want to go?
No, I was just going to add that most of my questions were already sort of discussed, so we're good.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for this really in-depth presentation and really high-quality conversation. I really enjoyed it. Have a fantastic day, and we will see you the first Wednesday of November, or December. Don't forget to vote next week. Have a great November.
Service announcement.
Yeah, public service announcement.